The fog was so thick that night that Augustus Vale could no longer see the lantern in his own hand. His boots crashed through the black water as he stumbled deeper into the black fens, breathing like a hunted man. Somewhere behind him, reeds whispered against one another with a sound too deliberate to be wind. He kept running around as though he expected someone to emerge from the mist, but there was never anyone there, only darkness. Endless water, endless reeds. Then the pale lights appeared. One, then three, and then dozens. Tiny blue flames floating above the marsh, will-o'-the-wisps. Augustus stopped so suddenly that muddy water splashed against his coat. His eyes widened, the lancer thumbled violently in his grip. And then it went out. Something fast and unnatural. One moment, there was flame from his lantern, and the next, there was nothing, only the sound of distant feminine humming drifting across the marsh, soft and ancient, so close enough that it raised the hair along his neck. The almighty Augustus Vale, the wealthiest industrialist in East Anglia, was covered totally in fear. That was the last time Augustus Vale was ever seen. Blackness swallowed him completely, and the blue flames faded into thin air. The villagers did not fear the disappearance, they feared who the marsh had protected. In 1856, Augustus Vale vanished into the Black Fens after accusing a woman of witchcraft before an entire village. Only his boots were recovered. Hi loves, welcome to another story that reflects the psychology behind power tussle while we explore romance and fantasy. Make sure to stay till the end because you can't afford to miss this story. Don't forget to hit that thumbs up and subscribe button. Somewhere in the outskirts of Ely, a town that sat right beside the fenlands of East Anglia, there had only been a little girl in the reeds. The black fence stretched across the outskirts of Old Ely like something alive. At the very edge of the wetlands stood a secluded fen cottage wrapped in climbing ivy and silver moss. Its darkened wooden walls had gathered decades of rain, yet the home possessed a strange quiet beauty beneath the shadows of the reeds. And at dusk, when the blue mist drifted low across the black fence, thousands of fireflies hovered above the reeds like scattered stars, making the lonely cottage appear less like a home built like a man's hands, and more like something the marsh itself had chosen to keep. That was where Catherine Parker was born. Her father had once been a respected physician in Ely before drinking and scandal ruined him. Her mother, Eleanor, was another matter entirely. The villagers spoke of her in lowered voices. They claimed she descended from the old fen women who could predict floods and locate bodies beneath the peat before they ever surfaced. No one knew whether the stories were true, but they crossed themselves whenever Eleanor walked by. When Catherine was 6 years old, her mother disappeared into the marsh during a storm. Nobody was ever found, just her shawl caught between the reeds. After that, the villagers stopped visiting the cottage entirely. Deliveries ceased, church women no longer brought food, children ran whenever Catherine approached the village market with her father. This entire change made her father slowly unravel. Some nights, Catherine would wake up to find him staring out the window towards the marsh with terrified, sleepless eyes. "She calls to me," he whispered once. Catherine had only been 8. "Who does?" she asked, but he never answered. By the winter 2 years later, Catherine turned 10. That was the night her father fled. Catherine remembered the sound of the front door opening before dawn. She had rushed from her tiny bedroom barefoot. "Papa," she called out, but he froze. The lantern lights made him look decades older. "You must stay here," he muttered. She stared at him in confusion. "Where are you going?" His eyes drifted towards the marsh beyond the window, towards the reed moving beneath the rain. And then he whispered in a sentence that haunted her for years. "The fen wants what belongs to it," he said. And before Catherine could reach him, he was gone. The flood water swallowed his footprints before sunrise, and he never returned. At first, the villagers expected the child to die within weeks. Yet winter passed, and then spring, and then another year. Still, Catherine remained. She learned which berries would poison and which would heal. She learned where fish gathered beneath the shallow waters at dawn. She learned to read the skies by the smell of the rain drifting across the peats. Isolation changed her into something one with nature. She noticed the marsh had moods. The villagers began calling her the Fen Wraith. Children dared each other to approach her cottage. Men claimed they saw her wandering barefoot through the reeds at night, carrying no lantern. Yet, the strange stories surrounding Catherine only deepened as she grew older. Birds gathered constantly outside her window. Wild dogs never approached her aggressively. Lantern flames flickered whenever she became angry or frightened. And more than once, fishermen admitted that Catherine warned them about storms hours before clouds appeared. Coincidence, the local pastor insisted, but even he avoided the marsh after sunset. The truth was simpler and far sadder than the legends. Catherine was lonely, painfully lonely, and in this isolation was where she grew up to be a beautiful young woman. Some evenings, she stood outside watching distant lanterns glow inside the village homes, wondering what it felt like to belong somewhere. The marsh became the closest thing she ever had to companionship, and sometimes it almost seemed to answer. It seemed to also protect her. One day, a group of drunken hunters spotted her moving through the reeds near dusk. "There she is," one man slowed excitedly. "The marsh ghost." Catherine immediately turned to leave, but the men followed her, laughing. One grabbed her wrist, another reached for her hair. "Easy now," one mocked. "We only wish to see whether witches bleed like ordinary women." Fear surged through her so suddenly that her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Then, one hunter shouted. Water was rising around their boots, too fast. The bog beneath them softened violently. One of the men lost his balance instantly, sinking knee-deep into the black pits. Another stumbled trying to pull him free. Panic replaced laughter, and immediately Catherine tore herself loose and made a run for it. Behind her came shouting and cursing, the terrible sucking sounds of mud swallowing boots. Although none of them died, but by morning, the story had spread throughout Ely that the Fen Wraith had nearly dragged hunters beneath the marsh itself. After that, even cruel men avoided her, and so Catherine's world grew quieter, until the arrival of Timothy Vale. His carriage wheels groaned against damp roads as he traveled towards Ely beneath a sky heavy with rain. And unlike his brother Augustus, Timothy disliked spectacle. He preferred books to parties, maps to politics, and quiet observations over command. Oxford had praised his brilliance in cartography and historical preservation. Industrial investors, however, saw practical value in his work. The rail companies needed accurate surveys before draining the fenlands, and that was why Timothy had been sent there, at least officially. By the second evening in Ely, he had already heard the stories. An innkeeper leaned closer while polishing glasses. "Stay out of the marsh after dark," a fisherman muttered. Men vanished there. A barmaid whispered, "You hear singing sometimes." Another villager claimed blue lights gathered outside the windows before deaths. Timothy dismissed all of it, as he thought superstition thrived wherever poverty and isolation existed. Until he saw Catherine. He had been sketching the marsh boundaries near dusk when movements caught his attention across the water. A woman stood among the reeds, motionless. Mud stained the hem of her dress. Loose strands of dark hair framed a pale face sharpened by solitude. But it was the stillness that unsettled him. She did not seem frightened by the marsh. She seemed part of it, and for several seconds, neither of them moved. And then a white screen landed quietly beside her, and Timothy lowered his pencil slowly. Catherine disappeared back into the reeds without a word. The villagers called her strange, but Timothy thought she looked lonely. Their first conversation happened weeks later during heavy rain. Timothy had taken shelter beneath the remains of an abandoned stone chapel deep within the marsh when Catherine appeared silently at the entrance, holding a bundle of reeds. Neither of them spoke at first, as rain hammered the broken roofs overhead. Finally, Timothy nodded politely. "You know the marsh as well." She gave a faint pause. "I was raised here." Her voice was softer than he expected. It wasn't eerie or ghostly like she had been painted. It was just careful, as though she had spent years speaking only when necessary. "You're the surveyor," she said eventually. "Archivist," Timothy corrected gently. "Well, mostly," he added. She glanced at the maps in his satchel. "You draw the marsh like a prison." The sentence startled him. "Well, I draw the boundaries," Timothy replied. "There are no boundaries here," she corrected almost immediately. And for reasons beyond what Timothy could explain, that answer lingered in his mind long after she had left. Their meetings became frequent after that, mostly never planned, almost accidental, yet somehow inevitable. Timothy began bringing her books during his visits to the marsh. At first, Catherine only touched them curiously, tracing the letters like symbols from another world. "You can't read?" he asked carefully one afternoon. Embarrassment flickered briefly across her face. "No one taught me," she said. Something inside Timothy tightened painfully, and so he decided to teach her. He was slow and patient. Beneath the willow trees and broken chapel, he guided her fingers across the pages, while distant birds called over the water. "That word," he murmured slowly, "is tide." "Tide," she repeated carefully. A smile touched Timothy's face. "You got it." For Catherine, reading felt like discovering hidden doors inside the world itself. Timothy brought her scientific journals, pressed flowers, tiny mechanical music boxes he repaired himself. Catherine showed him hidden pathways through the reeds, where ancient runes slept beneath the moss and water. She taught him bird calls. He taught her constellations. Together, they built an entire secret language stitched from curiosity and loneliness. And for the first time in Catherine's life, she began laughing. One evening, Timothy found her standing outside the cottage, staring towards the stars. "What troubles you?" he asked. Catherine hesitated. "Sometimes I think the marsh kept me alive only so I could never leave it." Timothy stepped beside her. "You're not owned by this place." Her eyes lifted slowly towards him. "You say that because it has never tried to keep you." The wind shifted softly through the reeds, and before fear could stop either of them, Timothy reached for her hand very gently and softly. Catherine stared at their joined hands as though no one had ever touched her without intending harm, and then closed her fingers around his. That night, neither of them spoke of love, but both understood it had already begun. Weeks later, while studying parish archives in Ely, Timothy discovered records older than the chapel itself, and what he found chilled him deeply. Every few decades, a wealthy landowner connected to attempts of draining the fenlands had vanished, and there was no trace of bodies, neither were there witnesses, only disappearance swallowed by the marsh. And disturbingly, the names Parker women appeared repeatedly beside those records, and before Timothy could fully investigate further, news arrived from Oxford. A prestigious scholarship awaited him, and it was fully funded by an anonymous benefactor. The opportunity could change his future entirely. Catherine tried to smile when he told her. "You should go," she said. "I will return," Timothy promised immediately, "and I will write to you constantly until then." For the first time since childhood, Catherine allowed herself to believe someone truly meant to stay. But after Timothy had left her for Oxford, the letters never arrived. Weeks passed, and then months. Catherine waited constantly near the old mill road beside the marsh, but nothing came. Until one evening, she noticed a black carriage standing motionless on a distant high road overlooking the fens. And the carriage remained there for 3 nights, always at dusk. Catherine could never properly see the man inside, only the faint outline of her broad shoulders and occasional orange glow of a cigar behind the glass. On the 4th evening, the carriage finally descended into the fen road. The sound reached her cottage before the vehicle itself did. Harness chains rattling softly, expensive horses breathing steam into the evening fog. Catherine stood near the doorway as the carriage emerged through the reeds, and when the door finally opened, she understood immediately that this man was nothing like Timothy. Timothy had entered the marsh quietly, almost apologetically, like a guest afraid to disturb sacred grounds. But this man, he stepped into it as though he owned it. Augustus Vale was much more taller than his brother Timothy. He was dressed in a charcoal overcoat stitched with ruthless precision. Everything about him looked expensive. Even his silver-headed cane seemed less like a support and more like a weapon disguised as elegance. It was his eyes that unsettled Catherine the most, as they did not carry Timothy's softness. "You are Catherine Parker," he said conclusively, rather than asking a question. Catherine said nothing. Augustus glanced toward the marsh behind the cottage with visible fascination. "So this," he murmured, "is the famous black fen." Rain began tapping lightly against the reeds, and for reasons she could not explain, Catherine suddenly became aware of how quiet the birds had become. "You have my brother's attention," Augustus continued, "which is not easily earned." At Timothy's mention, something fragile inside her tightened. "You know Timothy?" A faint smile touched Augustus' mouth. "I know him better than anyone." Something about the answer felt wrong. Augustus requested tea as though arriving at an estate rather than a marsh cottage. Catherine nearly refused him outright, but years of isolation had left her uncertain around powerful men, so she allowed him inside. The moment Augustus crossed the threshold, the cottage lantern flickered. His eyes immediately noticed, and he said nothing, but Catherine saw the observation quietly settle in his mind. Throughout the evening, he spoke politely, almost charmingly, asking about the fenlands, the flood cycles, the strange minerals buried beneath the peat. He possessed the dangerous kind of intelligence that disguised itself as curiosity. Yet, beneath every question, lingered another motive entirely. He never for once asked Catherine what she wanted, only what she knew. And when he finally departed, the cottage felt really colder afterwards, as though something had entered briefly and stolen warmth with it. The following weeks transformed the black fence completely. Augustus arrived with surveyors, engineers, investors, and men carrying steel instruments Catherine had never seen before. Laborers discussed rails expansion and drainage systems over expensive whiskey in early taverns. The villagers welcomed Augustus immediately. Of course they did. He brought money, promises, and modernity. He spoke in grand visions. "The future of England does not lie buried beneath swamp waters," he announced one evening inside the town hall. "Industries will tame these wastelands and turn them to prosperity." The room erupted in applause. Only the older fishermen looked uneasy. Catherine watched silently from the back of the crowd, and across the room, Augustus watched her watching him. The strange occurrences began almost immediately after the industrial crews entered deeper parts of the fen. Dead fish surfaced near the excavation routes. Compasses spun unpredictably. Fogs thickened without warning around machinery. One worker swore he heard women whispering beneath the reeds, moments before his equipment collapsed into the bog. Augustus dismissed every story publicly. "There is no curse here," he declared sharply during a dinner with investors. "Only a woman and frightened peasants." The men laughed, but later that evening, Augustus personally ventured deeper into the marsh alone, carrying one of Timothy's old survey maps. He did not fear the fen, and that was what made him dangerous. Rain drifted softly through the reeds as he followed Catherine's old pathways beneath the moonlight. Eventually, he reached a narrow stretch of black water where strange pale moss glowed faintly beneath the surface. And there, he saw it. The marsh reacted differently around Catherine. He had noticed it before he dismissed it as coincidence. Yet now, studying the land carefully, he realized the phenomenon repeated too consistently. Certain pit deposits carried unusual thermal properties no engineer could properly explain, and whenever Catherine herself entered those spaces, the readings intensified. Augustus crouched slowly beside the glowing water. Industrial progress depended on power, coal, steam, and expansion. But what if there existed another form of energy hidden beneath the fenlands entirely? Something organic, ancient, and responsive. He breathed slowly, and for the first time, Augustus stopped seeing Catherine merely as beautiful. He saw a possibility. The next morning, contracts were signed in Ely, and within days, Augustus Vale had legally acquired nearly the entire Black Fence territory, including Catherine's cottage. She learned of it when men arrived carrying official papers and measuring chains through her garden. "You cannot do this," she cried out. Augustus stood calmly near the carriage, while workers hammered new boundary markers into the wet earth. My dear Catherine, he replied almost gently, ownership is precisely how civilization functions. The weeds hissed softly in the wind behind her. Augustus stepped in closer. You have survived here admirably, he admitted. But survival is such a crude thing for a woman like you. You may continue starving in the mud, and then his eyes drifted towards the cottage. Or you may come to Ellie as my ward. His words sounded less like kindness and more like acquisition. I'll give you silk, Augustus continued quietly, warmth, education, and security. He paused, and in return, you will help me understand this land. Augustus Vale is treading upon dangerous waters. He hasn't only bought the marsh, but is trying to actively force Catherine out of it. She's now faced with a tough decision. Can she fight it, or she's going to accept Augustus Vale's demands? Find out in the next part as we've come to the end of this one. Don't worry, it's going to be coming 2 days from now, 30th May. So please stay tuned and turn on post notifications and don't forget to subscribe and like this video. Thanks for watching. Bye.